Hello everyone and welcome to the next chapter. Today we're going to be talking about shadows. Now most images have shadows and shadows have a very powerful effect on your image. It could be negative, it could be positive. This is shadows. Enjoy. Now what are shadows? Shadows are the dark areas of your image, if you can put it that way. From areas that are completely black all the way up into your midtones. These are the dark areas. These are shadows. Now they have a very powerful effect on your image. We need to understand their purpose and how to use them correctly, as shadows can be your worst nightmare in an image, and they can work really well, like in this one. They can frame your image. Man, I love this image. This is where shadows really work, and not every scene will give you such a good opportunity to use shadows. So let's go into it further and see how best to approach your shadows. One thing about shadows that we need to go over, and we've touched a bit on this in color, is that the human eye is naturally drawn to brighter areas. So in general, and now again, this doesn't apply to every image. There are always guidelines. I must always disclaim that because every scene is different. But usually we would want to keep the shadows off our subject or the main parts of our subject because we want it to have light and we want our viewer to see that. However, the problem about this is often photographers will then disregard what is in shadow, not realizing that those are important picture planes that help hold your subject or help bring the viewer towards your subject. And we must consider something else with shadows. We've spoken about dynamic range before. This is the range in which your camera can collect detail from the highlights to the shadows. Now on every camera, it is far easier and far more effective from receiving signals from the shadowed areas. What I mean by this is it's much easier to preserve shadows than it is to preserve highlights. So an area might look very dark to you in your image, and you might go into post-processing and think that's way too dark, I would have loved some more details, but you lift the shadows and all of a sudden the details are there. The camera is still getting a signal from the shadows, more than what we can see. There's a lot of detail in the shadows, and we must be aware of that, because if you want those details to be evident, realize that the camera is actually picking up a lot of details in those shadows, more than it is in the very bright highlights. And what this means is you can bank details in your shadows more than you can bank details in your highlights. So if you have an image with a very vast dynamic range, you've got areas that are very bright and you've got areas that are very dark, and you're battling to expose your subject correctly. You can underexpose your camera and reserve details in the shadows, even if it underexposes your subject, and fix it later, instead of overexposing and losing a whole bunch of detail and trying to fix it later. It's much better to underexpose and bank those details in your shadows. One of the most effective uses of a shadow is to create frames, create picture planes, hold your subject. Because it's dark and your subject might be bright, we can use shadows to create a powerful composition. If our subject is quite bright and we've aligned shadows correctly, we can have a bright subject with a whole bunch of dark shadow holding it in the right place, which is a very effective way of bringing your viewer onto the subject as effectively as possible. And not only can we use shadows to frame our subject, we can also use it to make obvious certain textures or shapes within an image. If we think about an elephant's skin, what's so quintessential about an elephant are those textures all over that skin. If there weren't shadows being cast over those textures, the textures would be very dull. You wouldn't be able to see them as well as if there were shadows being cast over them. So this is shadows being used really well to exemplify what is so important in an image, the textures of an image. So shadows here are important. And the same applies to if we were shooting something indoors like this. Corners of a wall, shapes inside a room. A lot of the time shadows give a secondary dimension to an object, which makes that object's shape more obvious. So shadows are often very important and a very useful tool in your storytelling arsenal. And one of the most powerful uses of shadows is when it's used to give a secondary dimension to your subject. Your subject's shadow is cast along a scape. You see the shadow first. The shadow leads you to your subject. This is a more rare way of using shadows and is quite often seen in drone photography or hot air balloon or helicopter photography if you can afford that, but can create some of the most beautiful stories using shadows. It accomplishes something that for me is one of the pinnacles of photography. When one object leads you into a frame immediately, and that object leads you to the most important factor, you're drawn into the image and you're taken onto a story. If you can accomplish that, now obviously shadows can have a negative impact, and we must go into some of them so that we can try our best to avoid them. In wildlife photography, we sometimes don't have a choice, but what quite often is the problem if we shoot in later parts of the day where the sun is strong and shadows are being cast. Those shadows can be cast all over the body of your subject, its face, and sometimes it doesn't matter, but sometimes it really does matter, especially when the strong features of your subject the eyes especially. Now, the eyes are the most powerful part of a live subject. If they are dark and a shadow is cast over your eyes, they lose a lot of that power. Now, we can fix that in post-processing, but unfortunately, as we've discussed before, when you lift the shadows, when you make a dark place brighter, you will lose detail, and sometimes too much detail. And when that detail is lost in the most important part of your picture, your live subject's eyes, it is highly detrimental to your image. And this can happen with the entire subject. If the whole body is in shadow and is really dark and you want it to be brighter, if you lift the shadows on it later, you will lose detail in that image. So where we can, we want the light to not cast shadows on our subject where we don't want them to. Like I said, in wildlife photography, you don't often have a choice and you've got to do the best you can. And sometimes the easiest way of combating this is just changing your angle on your subject. Quite often we want the light to land on our subject, but in later parts of the day, that light might be too high, so it'll be casting a shadow over the eyes. And what's a better option than that is actually having the light behind your subject where your whole subject is shadowed instead of just the eyes. That way, you've still got creative latitude in your post-processing. You can play around and still make a pretty image. But when your subject's eyes are shadowed and the face is very bright, it immediately takes all the power away from what should be the most powerful part of your image. So that's shadows. Use them correctly. Avoid negative impacts of shadows like the eyes. Shadows can really be a very powerful part of your storytelling process. That's shadows. I hope you enjoyed. See you next time.